I just wanted to do a little introduction here on why this is an important subject right now. And by the way, I'm trying a new headset. I've never had it before. My gracious husband gave me an early birthday present so that I could have it for this, which was very nice. Just wanted to mention that April, which was about 4 days ago, and May the 4th be with you today. Governor Mike DeWine signed a House Bill number 59, making Ohio one of the very first states in the country to have an entire month dedicated to native plants. Very exciting. I know I signed the petition for that, and very glad that a lot of people did, and they agreed to it. So we now have the month of April as Native Plant Month from now until whenever. So very exciting. So I'm going to share my slides with you now, and we'll get started. Oops, I don't know that. All right. So thumbs up, you can see it. Yep, okay, good. So, so we talked about, you know, oops, that's not the first slide. Let me go back to, the first slide, sorry. It came up on the wrong one. So we're gonna explore native plants today. And it's kind of one of my favorite subjects. I'm not gonna say that I am a true, one of those called dire native plant people, but I use a lot of native plants in things that I do, and have learned a lot about them over the years. So today we're going to talk a little bit about what their benefit is. How do we plant them so that they survive well? What different kinds of myths about them, because there are things that people say, oh gosh, I just don't want to plant a native, or things that you need to know about them to make them perform well. Cultivars and nativars are subjects that a lot of people have heard about. We're going to talk a little bit about what that means, what they are, whether they're okay to plant, whether they're not. What does that mean? And then we're going to talk about plants that we think are native but aren't. Actually, that one, I apologize, I did not put that information in there. So, but I could just tell you right now that I was very surprised that columbine, which a lot of us grow in our shade gardens, is not a native. It's actually not from this area. It was actually brought into our area. So if any of you have columbine in your gardens, that would be one that would be fitting in with that particular category. And I'm going to talk to you about a little bit about examples of some of the less known native plants to try out for yourselves, things that are available, and the changes and dangers that are facing natives today. And then we'll talk a little bit about the resources where you can actually get them. So what are natives actually? And I looked it up. Of course, Wikipedia is kind of our main sources for looking up what something is. And they state that native plants are plants that are indigenous to a given area in geological time. Well, that's a pretty wide definition right there. And what do they mean by that? This includes the plants that have developed or occurred naturally or existed for many years in an area. When I was going to school, they told us that things that were native were plants that were from the year 1750 on. Now, I don't know where they came up with that number. I don't know why they came up with that year, but I always found that was kind of an odd way to describe a native plant. I like the National Wildlife Federation discussion of what a plant is and what a native plant is. It's considered a native when it's occurred naturally in a particular region, ecosystem, or habitat without human introduction, and that really is what I would call a native. Plants are now becoming native that weren't native before too, which is a very interesting thing. And Doug Tallamy, you can see at the bottom of the slide, I have a quote from his book, The Living Landscape, which is an excellent book if you're interested in getting involved at all in natural plantings. What is a native in any place today, given place today, wasn't a native if we look back enough time. It's certain that what will be native in the same place in the future will be different from what is native now. So one of the things that I thought is very interesting about natives is that trees are changing their locations a lot. Plant, what is it? There's a detailed observation that 86 different tree species have shifted more than 25 miles west and 20 miles north in the last, it actually doesn't say how many years, but it's been within the period of when we've done a lot of research. That's a lot of tree specimens to change. And we'll go into a little bit of detail on that. One of the researchers at Purdue University says that trees aren't physically uprooting themselves and moving. Rather, it's just that saplings are thriving in new areas that are more hospitable as older trees are dying. And some of this is related very much to climate change. Some of it is related to just natural circumstances. So I give it a new native definition, which is more based on what I call origin. In other words, where did it come from in the first place? If it came from China, then no, it's not a native. Evolution would be the changes that are happening. That can include things also that are affected by climate change. And then functionality, and functionality would be, is it good for the environment? Is it something where the pollinators are using these native plants, or are they running away from them and not using them? So that's another very important part of native plants. The scarlet oak, by the way, I don't know whether any of you have ever, we've got 2 scarlet oaks in our memorial grove that got planted there. And nearly 3 decades ago, it actually moved more than 127 miles to the northwest from the Appalachian Mountains, where it's now in our area, which is very interesting because, you know, things move. Not everything stays the same. I know when I'm planting my gardens, a lot of times, there's a bunch of plants that I put in that normally would not have been good in this area, probably about 20, 30, 40 years ago. But now they are. They're doing fine here. So what are the benefits of natives? Natives themselves, as we all know, is the big thing is that they attract wildlife and they provide shelter. And of course, they're very good for pollinators, and that's really important also. They also attract beneficial insects, and one of those things is dragonflies, which are actually a very big eater of mosquitoes. So if you've got plants that are really good attracting things like dragonflies, then you're going to have less mosquito population. Unless, of course, you have a bunch of standing water sitting around. But so often also there's fewer diseases in the plants. So a lot of times when you're planting natives, you can guarantee those plants are going to survive much longer. So those are some of the benefits. There's more. They also preserve biodiversity. What I mean by that is that if you take a native oak tree and you support that actually can support over 500 species of caterpillars. And if you compare that to a ginkgo tree, which is actually a tree from China that grows here very well and is a very adaptable tree, and a lot of landscape firms use it, a lot of nurseries sell it, but it only supports 5 caterpillars, and that's it. And you can see the picture there of the, I don't know whether those are chickadees or not, but I think they're close enough. It takes 6,000 caterpillars to raise one family of chickadees. So the oak trees are extremely important for us to have around so that we have our diversity of caterpillars so that the birds can be fed. And there's also other things that, that eat caterpillars also. it also creates a healthier, more satisfying place to live. And part of that benefit is because it takes up CO2 from the atmosphere and creates a much nicer, more appealing area to live in. And it's also better for native wildlife also. The plants that are natives also work in our local soils because they're native. So you don't have to add a bunch of fertilizers. You don't have to add other kinds of things. You don't even have to add compost to your soil to actually grow native plants. They are used to our soils, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later in terms of how to make sure that they survive well in the soils. And that's what I call right plant, right place, something that you'll hear me talk about quite a bit. So why do native plants do so well in terms of their survival? It's because of their root systems. Here's a really great picture of the root systems of a number of different native plants. And you'll probably see in here, I don't know whether you can see my pointer or not, some of the things we have here. Compass plant is one of the ones that, that I have in my garden. The purple coneflower and the prairie drop seed is a great one. Switchgrass, these are all things that you can buy here locally. And you can see how long these root systems are. A lot of times they're way longer than the actual plant. Some of them can actually extend as far as 8 times as long as the actual plant, which means that they're going to be more efficient for water and nutrients. They're going to actually be able to pick up things. So if we have a drought system, you know, where they've been established a while and we end up with a drought, these plants can dig way down into the earth and bring up the nutrients that they need to be able to survive. So they can survive on a much smaller amount of water. They also help hold the soil in place, which is also a really good thing. You can see if you have all these different sizes of root systems, you can plant these things closer together. They're more fibrous type roots. They're not these big roots that start sending out tendrils everywhere and then create a problem where they're gonna not allow some other plant to take over, or they're not gonna take over other plants. But you can plant them much closer together, which means you're gonna have less weeds. You're gonna have a much nicer looking garden that's gonna look full and lush. So native plants are really great. Then part of it is also that they, because of this root system again, they pull water out of wet areas because plants need the water. So if you've got an area that has like a lot of moisture, I know in the back of our yard goes down at about a 1 or 2% slope. At the bottom of the very bottom of the yard, there is a very, very wet area. In fact, after yesterday's rain, there's puddles back there. I was just walking around the yard today, and there's puddles back there. So I have been planting grasses and different kinds of things back there that can actually take up a lot of that water and remove some of that standing water, which is what mosquitoes breed in. So they're also a benefit in that sense. They also store carbohydrates in their deep root systems, and they act as a carbon sink by taking up excess carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. And of course, you probably know that trees are like one of the best things to use in terms of trying to address our CO2 problem in the atmosphere. So let me see, let me make sure I've covered everything here. Oh, one of the other things I think is really good too is that native plants really don't require any fertilizers, like I said. So you're not going to have to use any of these, dangerous chemicals or things like that. People that want to have nice looking gardens can have nice looking gardens just by putting in native plants. So that's your root system. They're pretty amazing. So how do we plant natives so that they do well? Quite honestly, you don't just stick them in the ground. because there are certain places that plants go. And here again, I'm gonna keep saying right plant, right place. It's something to always keep in mind whenever you're planting anything, whenever you're putting any plants in the ground, whether it be a tree, whether it be a shrub, whether it be ground covers, anything, even annuals. You need to make sure that they're going in the right location of what they do the best in, because even native plants don't do well if they're a drought-resistant plant and they don't like wet soils. They're going to rot in a wet soil because they just survive in places they like the best. So determine your sun exposure first. So when you're planting, it's very important to know also whether they like shade, or do they like sun, or do they like part shade? Because we get some pretty hot summers coming around here, especially July, August, September. It really gets hot, and the sun can really burn up even native plants. So if you've got a plant that you're putting in and it says that it likes part sun, it likes a little shade in the afternoon, that is not a good plant to stick into your garden in the hot sun. And then we also want to start with the soil that you have. Like I said, native plants are great with soils, and believe it or not, the soil that you have has a lot of clay in it usually. And clay soils are not bad. Everybody says, oh, I got clay soil, I can't put anything in there. Well, clay soil is actually, a lot of it is our native soil. It's the clay soil itself, the problem with it is that it doesn't drain. But clay is actually one of the three components that's good for a good loamy soil. So you want to add different kinds of materials to that to break up the texture of the soil. That's the important part. So your clays just they're actually very fine and they coagulate together. So what you want to do is you want to use something that's going to break that up. And you can use shredded leaves from the fall. You can use, sometimes people actually use grass clippings, things like that. I happen to use a product that's called soil conditioner, which is a shredded pine bark. And if you put that in with your plant, when you're planting it, then it will break up that clay and you'll end up with really good drainage. Because most plants cannot handle water just sitting underneath them at all. So the next thing would be the no-till. There's been a lot of research over the last years on no-till, and it seems like no-till is probably the best method for a lot of planting these days. Because when you till something, when you dig down into the deep depths of something and starting to put in a garden, you bring up a lot of weed seed, and you also break up the structure of the soil. And we just talked about structure of soil is very, very important. You don't want something to be so mashed up that it doesn't have any structure and allow any water to flow through. So no-till is good, or if you've heard of a broad fork, that's something that's also available. It's just a big, oh gosh, I don't even know how to describe it. It's got two huge handles on it, and then it's got these big tongs at the bottom. And if you put your foot on it and step backwards, it actually just breaks up the soil with these big long prongs. It's also very important when you're planting things to avoid compacting the soil. When you compact the soil, you're going to create drainage problems again. So when you are planting and when you're doing your gardens, try to walk around the outside or put stepping stones in, things like that. So that you can walk around your plants and not compact the soil. And again, here we go, right plant, right place. Very important. So you need to research your plants. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the plants that I'm going to recommend later on. But it's very important that whatever plant you buy, just, you know, you might, I try to emphasize going to native plant sources and local garden centers. And when you go to local garden centers, a lot of the people there really kind of know what they're talking about. But even if they don't, it's really good to research the plant that you're buying. It's very, very easy to get something that somebody thinks is just great, and you get it home and you find out, oh, it really isn't one that's going to do well in the situation that I've got. So researching the plant is extremely important. Create layered gardens. Don't just plant a bunch of perennials. Create a layered garden. Start with shrubs, put in some trees. Nature, if you look at nature, nature starts out with a meadow. And then once the meadow is growing for a while, the trees start coming up. Grasses first, and then the trees start growing up, and the trees come up, and then there's shrubs that layer underneath that. So simulate nature when you're doing your plantings. Think about that. Plus, we need shade in our gardens to get away from the sun. So trees are awesome. Add native grasses where you can. Native grasses, there's one called a panicum, which I'll talk about later in my list of plants. And that particular grass is native. There's also some, the blue stems are native grasses, which are wonderful. In fact, there's a picture of it right here. I believe that's, no, that might be a panicum. But anyways, there are several native grasses around, and they don't also go so aggressive when they're growing over the years too, which is important. Create a seasonal interest. Plant something where when you're sitting in your backyard, or if you're sitting in your apartment, or if you're sitting looking out the windows, plant something so that you've got seasonal interest going on all year round. Your grasses are terrific for seasonal interest. This happens to be a chokeberry up at the right-hand top side there. Chokeberries are great for birds, and it blooms about now, maybe another week or two from now. And then to your right, we've got some liatris and some goldenrod, which are blooming later in the summer. So the plant at the top is going to bloom earlier, the chokeberry is. The grass is going to kind of be green all summer long. And then in the winter, it's going to have this beautiful look that you can keep going. Also, leave the dead stems over the winter for wildlife and insects. Used to be, well, when I was in working for several landscape firms, the rule of thumb was you got to make it look really pretty all the time. And even in the winter time, they would cut everything down to bare bones. And wildlife, birds, insects live in this dead material over the winter. And they're very essential for our well-being and having, you know, good natives, good native pollinators and good native insects around all the time. So let me see, did I skip one? No. Okay, so myths about native plants. What I've always heard over the years is that, native plants, you got to plant native plants because they don't require any maintenance. You just put them in your garden and they just grow. And if you want to have a whole bed of black-eyed Susans, I would say yes, that would be very true. But if you don't want a whole bed of black-eyed Susans and you want to have a little bit more diversity, there's a picture at the bottom there. You can see there's some black-eyed Susans in there. There's some other, I think that's cardinal flower, the red that's showing up in there. And there's a couple shrubs and things. This is all maintained. This is not something that is just a natural wild-looking space. If you want to have a wild-looking space, then create a meadow or something like that. But maintenance is always required, and especially the first 2 or 3 years. There are plants that need to be pruned back and need to have some help because they're young and they're new. And one example I would give would be the red buds. We all love the red buds that we see. They're just now finishing up their spring bloom. If you look along the side of the hillsides and stuff, you'll see them going up I-71. If you look in the woods, you'll see them on the edge of the woods. But they're very, very thin. You'll notice in the woods, they're real thin. They've got beautiful branches coming out, but there's not a lot of branches coming out. So if you like that look and you want more of a natural look, that's good. But if you want something to fill out And to have, you know, like a red bud that really pops and really shows you some beautiful blooms and so on, it's going to take a little maintenance over several years of pruning to get that plant to look good. Not all native plants are drought tolerant. In fact, there are some plants that absolutely do not like hot sun, like I said before, and some of them are meant for wet places. One example of that would be a carex. It's a type of grass, but it's actually not. It's they call it carex, so I don't know what the common name is. But it looks like a grass, but they like cooler kinds of locations. I think of also like the hydrangeas. A lot of your hydrangeas, if you go hiking in the woods, a lot of the ones that are down in like Big South Fork or Red River Gorge, they're in the shade. And they're in the shade because they're gonna dry up and shrivel up if they're put out in a very hot, sunny location. But there are a lot of native plants that become drought tolerant. The first 2 to 3 years, though, you need to water them. It doesn't matter if a plant says it's drought tolerant. You must water it the first 2 to 3 years until it gets established. The first year, it usually just kind of gets established, gets a little bit of root system going. The second year, the roots will really start taking off. By the third year, the roots have really started taking off. And by that time, then the plant is going to be much closer to what you want that plant to be for drought tolerance. Then also not attractive in garden designs. Well, I think that the garden design at the bottom is just gorgeous. So I would say that's not necessarily true. And that's more a matter of whether you're, you know, doing some, a little bit of maintenance, cutting some things back, or how it gets designed. Any native is good to use in your garden. I would disagree with that one also, because there are some natives that will take over your yard. And like I said, the black-eyed Susans is one of the ones that requires usually quite a bit of maintenance. I've had plants given to me over the years that are natives, and they're wonderful. One of them is Alexander, Golden Alexander. It's a native plant. Somebody gave it to me a number of years ago, and I put it in, and about 5 years later, my gosh, I couldn't get it out of there. And I wanted to move it, but it was very, very hard to move. So here again, research your plants, make sure that you're doing things that are, wait a minute, oh, okay. I just want to make sure that Nicole wasn't trying to give me a message. Make sure that you're doing things that are, that you're thinking through when you put them, and you can end up with some absolutely beautiful designs with native plants. So let's talk about cultivar and nativar. I'm going to take a drink of water here a second and start talking about that. So cultivar, nativar, what are they? What exactly are they? Well, a cultivar is actually a plant that's produced by selective breeding. Let me get to my notes here, because I've got some other notes that I want to make sure I share with you guys here on this. So the example to the right here is one that's actually from my own yard. I actually took that picture in my backyard. This is a button bush. A button bush is actually a native plant. It normally grows along the edge of a wet area, but I happen to have it on the edge of my patio, and I just make sure that I water it real well. And it's just below some hanging plants that always get watered all the time, so it works real well. But normally, a button bush would be about a 10, 15-foot plant. That's pretty big. My yard can't handle a 10 or 15-foot plant. So that's where they've come out with things like cultivars. A cultivar is where they do either selective breeding, or they do what's called vegetative propagation to create a plant that's either got a little different size to it, might have a little different, a little better in flowering capability, things like that. And there are times when these are done well. There are times when they're not done well. So it really, really depends on the plant. But they do they are from a native, they can be from, I should say, a cultivar is not always from a native plant, but a cultivar can be from a native plant. Now, a nativar is actually definitely from a native plant, and it's usually some kind of natural variant that's found in the wild, and then the horticulturists and the plant nurseries bring that wild plant into cultivation. It could be something where they've got a it's called a witch's broom. If anybody's ever heard of a witch's broom, and I'm not talking about the one around Halloween. This is where, if you look up in a tree, sometimes you'll see them. They're kind of like like the tree itself started doing something really strange and started creating a new shoot coming out of it. And these people will go around and look for these in native plants, and they will take those, and then they will propagate those and turn them into, in some situations, they'll turn them into a much better plant than the original natives. One of the things I think of is sugar. What is it? Silver maple. Silver maple is a native plant, but silver maples, you actually can't find them very much anymore because they're actually very messy, and they don't last very long. They're pretty brittle, and they usually create a lot of problems if they're built, especially around homes and things like that. So they've taken that particular silver maple and they've crossed it over with a sugar maple and created some better trees. That would actually be a cultivar at that point. A nativar would be one that was taken right from the silver maple itself. I'm trying to think. I had some other examples of that. Yeah, sometimes they're also a plant mutation. That's the other thing that can happen sometimes in these nativars. Like if you got somebody that's out searching and they're looking in a meadow that has a bunch of native bee balm in it or something like that, and they see a bee balm that's got a really, really beautiful color to it, and they see a bunch of it, you know, they might take that particular plant and cultivate it and turn it into something where then with these nativars, they end up with a lot more plants that have these better color, which creates a much prettier garden. So that's the difference between cultivar and nativar. So are they really okay? Are they good for us in our environment? Well, one of our researchers has a quote from I can't read his name, Ryan McArony, he's the guy that invented the button bush. Sorry, the button bush that I have, and it's actually called Sugar Shack. And it is a cultivar, and that particular button bush was brought to market just in 2017, very recently. And what he says is nativars allow us to retain the ecological benefits of native species while making them adaptable and accessible to the modern landscape. Because a lot of us just don't have these huge landscapes. We've got smaller landscapes, we've got pocket parks, we've got situations where we can't use these huge plants that are in their native form, and so they create nativars that we can still have all the benefits. But they're smaller size, but it's still, as you can see, a fantastic pollinator. The butterflies just swarm on this plant. So, so it's really, in that situation, I would say it's a good nativar. In the middle here, we've got some asters that, asters in the wild are kind of a lighter color. They've worked on the foliage being a little bit thicker, not being so scrawny. Native asters can be kind of weedy looking. So they've worked on these nativars to become a better color, but they still do really well for pollination and for taking care of our environment. And then here on the right-hand side, you can see the bee that's actually a penstemon, which is a native plant. And the bee is going into it. They've actually created penstemons with larger flowers. So the bees actually have a better chance of getting in there and doing their pollination. So they actually can improve pollination. But like I said before, I'm going to say it again, research, it's really important because some plants do real well and some plants don't. And if we look down here on the left-hand side, that happens to be a winterberry. And a winterberry is a plant that's really fantastic for birds. You see the red berries on it. It's not a honeysuckle. I know it looks like that from far away. But this is a great plant to replace a honeysuckle with. And I have a bunch of these in my yard, and the birds just love them, and they're beautiful in the winter. But they have much larger fruits than the native winterberry. These are actually these are some varieties, some cultivars that are actually improving the size of the berries. And the birds really like them. What happens is in the winter, you get this beautiful red berry. The leaves turn yellow and fall off, and you get these red berries all winter because the birds don't go for the berries until it's about January or February. When things start warming up, the berries start softening up. They're too hard for them to eat in the winter. And then they start softening up. So you get the advantage of this beautiful red berry in the wintertime. And then in the fall or in the spring, the birds get them. And then basically all the berries are gone and the leaves start coming back. And so you get a great shrub all year round. Here on your right-hand side and the bottom, this is I know what it is. It's a sumac, sorry. It's a sumac, and I don't know whether all of you know sumacs. I knew I grew up in Cleveland, and sumacs were everywhere, and they have those big red tufts flowers that are kind of feathery looking. They're beautiful in the landscape, but they get to be absolutely huge, huge shrubs, and they sucker like crazy. So if you plant one, you end up with like 50 of them in about 5 years. So the other advantage of a nativar is reduced suckering, is that you can plant something that is a native, but you're not going to have to worry about it taking over your whole garden. So now let's go to the nativars, the bad and I call the ugly. So the bad to me are where they've taken a perfectly good plant. Here on the left-hand side, this is an aster. It's actually called purple dome. And I didn't know this before I bought them. It's got a beautiful flower production, but it basically has no pollinators at all. They have bred out the pollinators. So this is what I would call a nativar that I would not purchase. There are definitely many, many wonderful types of asters that are out there that do still, in fact, even do better for pollination. So you have to be careful again on which one you get. And then here on the right-hand side, this is a salvia, which is I'm trying to think, salvia is also an herb. And this has a gorgeous red color, but when they worked with this plant, after a period of time, it didn't create much nectar anymore. So at that point, no, it's not a good pollinator, and it's not something that would be recommended to plant in your garden. And then what I call the ugly at the bottom, I never liked these plants. This is actually a spruced up coneflower. If all of you know the purple coneflowers, they've actually taken this plant and they've what I call weakened it, but they've created this big mound of fluff over the main part of where the bee goes in, and the bees can't even get into the plant anymore. So it doesn't even allow for pollinators to be in the plant anymore. So if you're doing any kind of native plants, purple cone flowers are fabulous and they're great, but if you do want to have a different color or something, look for one that looks very similar to the actual purple cone flower and may have been more of a nativar that maybe got white or something like that. So, okay, so what are the changes? What are the dangers that are facing our natives today? One of the biggest ones is insect infestation. We have more infestations coming in than we've had before. Of course, there's always going to be infestations, but we're starting to have some things happen that are coming back again. For example, the emerald ash borer. Originally, about, I think it was 8 or 10 years ago, it was on the east side of town, or on the west side of town. And then it just came back with a vengeance about 3 or 4 years ago, where it hit the east side of town. And I know Cincinnati Parks was having to deal with a terrible situation with the emerald ash borer, and they lost a huge amount of ash trees in some of their woods and stuff. We've also heard of the Asian longhorn beetle. This is one that came in from China, and that one was brought over, actually brought over in some wood that was moved from China to here and was in the wood and then ended up infesting our area. So we have a lot of infestations. I've just learned recently that the giant sequoias now are being infested by a new bark beetle. So that's a new infestation. Don't know where it came from, but that's a problem. And we also, if any of you have viburnums in your landscaping at all, there's a new viburnum leaf beetle. It's been around a while. And right now it's still in pretty much the southeastern part of Ohio, but it is heading this way. So those are the kind of things, and some of that is climate change, because they are more attracted to warmer areas. And as we warm up, then these kind of infestations come in more. And actually, I was going to read to you here. Some of these things are introduced also by garden stores. You don't find that too much anymore with your local garden centers are pretty smart about not bringing in things that they know are going to create a problem. I'm sorry, I'm talking about invasive plants now. Sorry. The invasive plants, like we all know about the honeysuckle, that was started brought in as a plant from Japan to hold our soils on hillsides, and also as a landscaping plant before they really knew anything about this kind of invasive problem. We also have a problem with, we know about lesser celandine. That's become a very serious problem. It's that lovely little yellow plant that everybody thinks, oh, it's so pretty early in the spring, and comes up, and then it very quickly disappears and leaves nothing but soil around it, and it completely wipes out all of our ephemerals, all of our bulbs, the native wildflowers that come up. A lot of our parks and our parks areas have been taken over by this particular lesser celandine, and they don't know. They have not come up with a good way to resolve it, unfortunately. Then kudzu, believe it or not, kudzu here on the right is coming our way. It's actually showing up in Kentucky already. And that is something that as we warm up will probably come our way. Garlic mustard is another one that came in from some kind of introduction. And same thing with purple loosestrife. That's something that was an introduction, I believe, from Japan also, or maybe some of them come in from Europe. They were garden plants that got out of hand. Sometimes they revert back to their original native variety, which is when they can sometimes become invasive because they're not from our native region. The other one that's a really big problem is on the right-hand side in the bottom, porcelain berry, and I want everybody to look out for this one. Porcelain berry is a really serious problem right now. It looks like a grapevine. It has these absolutely gorgeous berries that come on it, and you can see they're purples and blues and pinks. It's a very pretty vine, but it is starting to come in and take over a lot of our trees. It's going to be another kudzu type vine if we don't take care of it and watch it. And it's taking over our native species, our native vines that are growing, that we need to make sure that we don't lose. As I mentioned, the weather changes that have been happening are huge. When I first went to horticulture school, it had only been 2 years since they had changed from a zone 5, there's zones 1 through 10, I believe. There might be an 11, but it's really, really hot there. 1 would be the coldest area and 11 would be the hottest area. And we are zone 6B now. We went from a 5 to a 6B. And one of the things I think that was the most disheartening, I went to a workshop at the Civic Garden Center, and Greg, who's their horticulturist there, did a really good talk on I don't remember what the title was, but he talked about the changes and the shifts in terms of our zones. And he said that he'd just been to a lecture at the U.S. Forestry Service over in Indiana, and that they have already predicted that we're going to move from a zone 6B, which is what we're at right now, to a zone 9, which is what Florida is, in about 80 years, which is like way, way, way ahead of the game. This is going to be one of our biggest problems for natives and for us also at the same time. Natives don't really respond too well to climate changing. And I've got a quote from May 2019 from the National Science Foundation. Native plants were unresponsive to climate warming, whereas non-native species shifted their flowering earlier. Non-natives may gain an advantage as climate change proceeds. So this is why it's so important for us to keep our natives here and keep them going. We don't want to become a non-native type landscape, especially the invasive types. And as it says also, the native dogwoods, we're having trouble with our dogwoods even. The native dogwood is just not surviving as well as it used to. It went through a little bit of a disease problem a while ago, but it's even having trouble with some of the hotter temperatures and stuff. So we're kind of seeing that shift more north. The highest average temperature and shifting precipitation patterns are also causing plants to bloom earlier. I've noticed this myself in my own garden. I'm really surprised when I see something opening up, and then of course this spring it was pretty tough and we're still in the middle of it. Here we had all this stuff open up, about a month ago. It got really hot, things started opening up, and then the temperature drops. And then the blooms shrivel up, and then we lose all of our beautiful blooms. And this also has an effect on plants. Plants don't show their effects immediately a lot of times. Plants can show their effects, 10, even 20 years away from when they're affected by something. That's the reason why with your trees, native trees and things like that, if we get drought periods, run a drip of water on your trees, because you will be very happy you did that, because in 10 years from now, you won't have that tree not surviving. Because a lot of times the trees die because of what happened to them. I was reading a book called The Venerable Trees, and one of the things that the author of that, and his name's not coming to mind right now, but he said that that trees, they've actually discovered now, and I believe he's from Purdue University, which is a very big U.S. forestry service area. Trees themselves actually never, they are immortal. They actually do not have any reason to die whatsoever. The only reason why they die is because of something else killing them. And I think that's just an interesting thing to keep in mind. We really should never lose any of our specimens. It's usually something else that does it. And then the southern plants moving into the area. I know I've got 3 or 4 southern plants that are now in this area and considered to be native. One of them is called a smoke bush. If you guys have ever heard of smoke bush, that's actually considered a native plant now in this area. And then, of course, our important plant pollinator connections are being disrupted. You know, as we put in more highways or separate out some of the parks from other parks and don't allow for those green spaces to be in there, those plant pollinator connections get disrupted. And that's partially because of what we're doing in terms of building, and it's partially also what's happening in terms of climate change. So the National Wildlife Federation had a really good quote, and I wanted to emphasize this. These are major warning signs indicating that we need to take the meaningful steps now to curb our carbon emissions. Give a strong relationship between gardens and natural variables such as temperature and rainfall. A changing climate will create some enormous new challenges for gardeners. Numerous studies show any potential benefits from a longer growing season will be outmatched by a host of problems, from watering restrictions to damaging storms to the expansion of unruly weeds and garden pests. And I know I've seen this myself in my own garden. I've been a gardener for many, many years, and my parents were gardeners. And I think it's much harder these days to try to keep track of weeds. I do not use chemicals in my own garden. I am not a purist totally. I do use things to kill my honeysuckle, and that I kind of have to use chemicals. But I have noticed that it seems to be much more difficult to keep up with the weeding than it used to be. And, you know, I'm trying to do what I can, and I'm learning new methods. Part of that is where we're talking about native plants and being able to grow things closer together. The closer that you can grow something together, the less weeds you're going to have because they're not going to be able to get the sunlight. So let's talk a little bit about some of the native perennials that you could try. I think we're still good on timing. Okay. All right. Some of these are things, these are actually some things that are in my own garden that I very highly recommend. And they're also plants that are available in our nurseries. So these are things that you can pick up today and put in your plant, in your garden. Cup plant is the first one, and they actually, these are huge. I think mine are 6 feet tall when they finally bloom. But I put them, this would be a plant that you would put way in the back of the yard. You'd have to have a pretty good sized yard to grow them. But the cup plant is just fantastic. It's a great pollinator. It has leaves that actually collect the water in the leaves. It kind of cups around the stem. So it's a really great plant in terms of drought tolerance. And once you get them established, they're fantastic. And it's like this big, huge burst of yellow at the end of the summer, usually in September, October, around that time. Next one is the Eastern Blue Star. Eastern Blue Star is, it's actually, it's an Amsonia is the common term for it. This is a gorgeous plant because it's just a small shrub, maybe 2 to 3 feet, something like that. Some of them can get to be 4 feet if you get some cultivars. But the native is about a 2 to 3 foot plant. It has kind of a bluish green leaf to it, so it adds some really nice color to your garden. It does like sun, but it can handle a little bit of shade. The next one is the New England aster. New England asters are just wonderful plants, and you can see there's a monarch in this. And I'll be honest with you, it's not easy to find pictures of anything but butterflies on plants. And I've never been very successful at trying to take pictures of bumblebees on plants, or any kind, not bumblebees, but other native bees and stuff like that. They're kind of hard to find for free. So here's the New England aster. Again, blooms kind of late in the summer, and you can see the yellow on the left and the purple on the right are both blooming around the same time. So it really creates a beautiful contrast in your garden. At the bottom, rattlesnake master, fabulous native plant. You'll see these in meadows. If you walk out at Miami Whitewater, I think they've got them out there. And I just started to grow some of those the last couple of years, and they're just so interesting. They look like little gray thistles, but they're natives, and you can see they're mixed in with some coneflowers here on the left-hand side. In the left-hand middle, we've got the hyssops, fantastic pollinator plant. It was the plant of the year last year. You can get this as a native. This is the purple giant hyssop, which is the true native. There is also several nativars and some cultivars that are available with this plant. And I'd have to do the research to find out which one of those actually are still good pollinators. I would be careful on some of those. And by the way, all of these plants have been looked up under the USDA Department of Agriculture for being native plants in our area. This is the next one. It's the yellow wood poppy. That's actually my own picture. And I was graced with one of these plants 10 years ago, or no, it would have been 8 years ago, when I was just getting married, and I had a plant shower. And I had a whole bunch of people get me a bunch of plants, and this was one of them that came with that group of gifts. And it is the most, I love it. It does like shade. It will spread slowly, but the yellowwood poppy is just gorgeous, and those blooms last for, gosh, 4 to 6 weeks at least. And eventually you'll get another one that will show up in another part of your garden, but it's just an occasional one here or there that will start. They're not aggressive. Then on your right-hand side in the bottom, the penstemon, this is the same plant that we saw that bumblebee in the flower. And this is your native penstemon. And there are a bunch of other varieties on this. The natives are, this is actually the one that you see out in the wild more. So then we got shrubs to look at. Coral berries, one that a lot of people are probably not familiar with. And this is one that I've wanted to try. I haven't had a chance to. But it is a native plant. And you can see how pretty the berries are. It's about a 3 to 4 foot shrub. Very, very pretty leaves, kind of a bluish green. And stays a fairly small size shrub. So you can use it as a full native there if you've got a smaller landscape. In the middle, again, my button bush, and this one I did have the chance to, I think there's a bee right there in the middle that was on it. That is a fantastic pollinator and just a beautiful shrub, and it's got the most interesting flowers. You can see why it's called a button bush. I call it the Sputnik bush. Then on the right-hand side, we've got a 9-bark. That's a native, and this is your native variety, which has got white flowers to it. There's a bunch of other cultivars that are available on this one. Yeah, most of them are cultivars because they've got, yeah. And that also is a great shrub. Now that will get to be a fairly large shrub, but some of the cultivars can get all the way down to 2 to 3 feet. So you can still get all the same benefits with a smaller shrub. On the left-hand side, that's a black chokeberry, and this is a true native. On your left-hand side is the berries, and those also, you'll have those berries during the winter. They also stay hard, sort of like the winterberry did, and then the birds will eat them, and actually you can make jam out of them. So they're actually, all of these are also human edible. And then on the right-hand side of that same picture is the flowers that come out kind of late spring, mid to late spring. In the middle is Virginia sweetspire, which some of you may know by the name of Itea. This is a smaller plant, and it has a very gorgeous kind of a yellow, red, burgundy color in the fall. So it's also a really good shrub for fall. On the right-hand side, this is one that I just planted a couple years ago. It's called a fringe tree. This is something that if you go over to Spring Grove Cemetery, you will see several fringe trees. I think they bloom like about early summer or midsummer, somewhere around that time, but you get that white frothy look, and that is a true native. Just a beautiful tree, and even the leaves are just gorgeous when it's just all solid green. Here's some trees to try out. Eastern red cedar. I'm sure you drive down I-71 and you see these trees, evergreens up on the side of the hills. We got them here also in Cincinnati on the side of the hill. That's your eastern red cedar, your junipers. The native eastern red cedar is this Virginiana. There's also some cultivars and some nativars that are available on that with smaller varieties that have narrower footprint, or they can be a little bit more blue or a little bit different colored berry, things like that. But the birds love these. And the eastern red cedar is the only evergreen that is native in this area. All the other evergreens, like pine trees that you see here and so on, were brought here. Then middle tree, one of my favorites, the witch hazel. Witch hazels bloom in February usually. And so when you've got that winter weather and it's drab and you're kind of looking for something to kind of shake you out of those winter blues, witch hazels will bloom. This is the native, which has a yellow bloom on it. Again, there are some cultivars that have some oranges and different colored flowers, mostly yellows and some oranges. But it's just a gorgeous tree. It has kind of an abstract feel to it. And so it makes a very interesting kind of what we call a focal point in your garden. And these also they're really, really good for pollinators and for birds and things like that. On your right-hand side, this is a tree that I planted about 4 years ago, and I think it's probably going to take about 7 years before it blooms like this. It's called the American snowbell, and it is a native plant, and it is something that you can find in this area. They do have them at some nurseries. And it's not a very big tree, but the leaves are beautiful, and it's an understory type of tree. And here you can see that obviously it's a good pollinator. On the bottom, American spoke tree, I mentioned this once before. This actually just became more of a native to our area because it has moved here because of the warmer climates. It loves heat. It's a great tree for that. And it gets this kind of a really smoky, beautiful look to it. The native trees are quite large. And again, you can find some nativars or cultivars that are smaller to fit into smaller spaces. On the right-hand side, we got the yellow wood, which is one of our native trees. This is one that we've actually planted in the Memorial Grove. We've had a couple of these put in there, and you can see it's eventually going to have these beautiful white blooms also. So that'll be really nice to have. Ground covers, I'm just going to cover a few of those. Wild ginger, I would say, is one of my favorite ground covers. It does better in a shadier situation, but it's just a wonderful ground cover spreader. And if you want to start something that kind of takes over and eliminates a lot of weeds, this is a really good plant, the Canadian wild ginger. I know it says Canadian, but it's actually native in our area. Then the cutleaf geranium. This is actually the variety that I have. This is our native geranium. Has a really pretty purple flower to it. These are available at our local nurseries. And that will also spread as a wonderful ground cover. Foam flower is pretty much straight shade, but I know a lot of us have been on hikes in areas where we've seen foam flowers blooming, and those are now available. You can purchase those from nurseries. They have them in the native species. And then on the left-hand side, the woodland stonecrop. This is one that that we used to go on wildflower hikes, and I think Randy, you're watching, you and Jan. Anyways, we used to go on wildflower hikes, and we used to find this stuff when we were down in Big South Fork. And it's also a native to this area, and I have some of this in my garden. It does quite well, and it's blooming right now. And then here's your switchgrass. I was mentioning the grasses. If you want to add some really nice texture to your garden, plus winter interest. On the left-hand side is when it's blooming, kind of towards the end of the summer. It will be green up until then, and then it puts these plumes out. And then on the right-hand side, that is the winter look. It's a very, very pretty kind of a goldish yellow color. And this is your native switchgrass. Vines to try. Virginia creeper. Can't say enough about Virginia creeper. It's just a wonderful plant. People sometimes let it grow up their houses. It is a native. It's one that we see a lot of times, and it's been considered a weed for many, many years. But finally, there has been a change in people's attitude about this plant, and they are starting to actually even sell it in some of the nurseries. You can actually go out and just get it. Probably in your own yard, it probably shows up. But it's a wonderful plant. It will become somewhat aggressive, so you got to be careful where you plant something like this. And that's true of some of the vines. Crossvine, this is one that you'll see in the middle. That's one that you can find at the Cincinnati Zoo. They grow a lot of crossvine, and I've been wanting to put one in. I haven't yet, but that's a fantastic plant. If you go into the woods at all and look up a tree, you will see crossvines growing and blooming at the top of trees when you're on your nature hikes. Right-hand side is your native clematis. That is definitely very available in nurseries. This will get very aggressive. It's not super aggressive, and it's really easy to tame. But it is something that will grow very full and will just keep going probably 10 or 15 feet if you want it. On the left-hand side at the bottom, these are some bulbs that are available now. You can get trout lilies, which we see over in California woods. In the middle, Jack and the Pulpits are available now. You can put them in your own garden. As long as now in that situation, you want to have a really fairly decent soil situation, because if you ever walk through California woods or some of the forest areas where there's a lot of native wildflowers, you'll notice the soils are really quite good in those situations. So something like this, like I said, right plant, right place, would need to go in a situation where you've really gotten your soils back into good condition. And I was mentioning before, one of the things I use a lot is called pine fines, and I'll remind that again. That's all I use for fertilizer, other than for some of my plants that need acid, I use hollytone, which is also a natural fertilizer. But that is all I use in my garden for anything. In fact, I do not mulch. I use pine fines for my mulch, and that will actually be a good product for you to use and put in your gardens, and then it gradually goes down into the soil and improves your soil quality. Then one of my other favorites, which is actually a bulb, is the dwarf crested irises, and you can purchase these. I have not seen them in the stores, but you can definitely get these online at some of these native nurseries. They've got bulbs that you can purchase. So what can you do yourself? You can plant these natives or support native plantings wherever you can. Purchase plants from local nurseries that support pollinators and native plants. And most of our local nurseries do support pollinators. I do highly recommend that you go to nurseries where they actually grow the plants themselves or have a local resource for getting the plants in. As a lot of you know, I worked at Natorps for about 3 or 4 years, part-time. They grow 80% of their plants there, and they have a big support for pollination. Also, I've got a list of some other places. There's a lot of very good local nurseries that are right within our area to go. And I highly recommend you go there versus some of your big box stores. You just don't know what you're going to get at the big box stores. Some of them do use some of the nurseries and locals around, but they don't have the same kind of care of taking care of them. So if you get them early in the season at a box store, it's not too bad. But if you get them late in the season, you don't have any clue how something's been taken care of. And then the most important things is contacting your elected officials themselves and urge them to have strong plans to combat climate change, because our natives are really going to struggle with the climate changes that are happening, and our wildlife are also going to struggle from all these climate changes. It's not all about us. It's about all the other things around us too. And then vote, obviously, for those people who support these beliefs, and vote, period. Just make sure you vote. So here's some resources, and this is just a really, really small list of some of the places that I might get some of my plants from. There's a wonderful all-native nursery that's over near Spring Grove called Keystone Flora. It's a couple of ladies that, it's over in the old Wooden Shoe Hollow area. And these people have been growing native plants now for when the first native plant binge started about 10 years ago. And they've got quite a nice little nursery. I would recommend calling them and finding out when they're open. It's not like a nursery that you go in and you just go pick out your plants and come back. You do need to call them, make sure there's somebody on board to be able to go take care of them, because it's not a really big place, but it's quite amazing. Growing Value is another one. This is actually started by Braden Trouth, who is the person who runs the Permaculture Institute. Started that here in Cincinnati, and they have moved. They originally were down near Building Value down in Northside, and they have moved to Upper Price Hill now, somewhere around Enright. And they also have a new Kentucky location. And I don't know where that is. You'd have to find out from them, but you can look them up online. These are all online. They all have online websites. Dropseed Nursery is also a place that's very close by, down in Goshen, Kentucky. I haven't actually used them, but I know a lot of other people that do and find them very good. For your local garden stores, the main ones would be probably Natorps, Greenfield Plant Farms, and West Hills Greenhouses. They're also open for, for things. West Hills doesn't really grow as many of the native plants. Greenfield and Natorps pretty much focuses more on the native plants, but they all have natives. They also all have cultivars, and they also all have plants from other countries. So you do need to know your plants, or ask one of them, because the people there at these particular nurseries are extremely knowledgeable. I know White Oak Garden Center is also another one I didn't list, but there's going to be a big list that you can look at in just a minute. Local native plant sales are important too. I just listed a couple of them. Civic Garden Center normally has their plant sale. It would have been this last weekend. It's a fantastic way to get native plants. And you also have people that are there from various garden groups. You've got they're the people that take the classes in gardening. I'm sorry, my brain's not remembering what they're called. Master composters, master gardeners, sorry. Master Gardeners group really know their plants also, and they run a lot of the things that go on at the Civic Garden Center. The zoo, the same thing. They have fantastic plant sales. If you look online, you can go to their plant sales. They've got a place which is out north of here, where they actually have a huge meadow that they've done that's a pretty cool project to check into sometime. And then our native plant nurseries, which are online. I'm just listing 3 of them: American Beauties, Prairie Moon Nursery, and Midwest Ground Covers are 3 of the ones that I have purchased some things from. There are many others. This is just a very, very small list. And what I would recommend is that you go to the link at the bottom, which is from the Ohio Native Plant Month. And that's from this last April. They actually have a website that is for Ohio Native Plant Month.org. And if you click on it, you can actually go to, they got a source on there that you can bring up online. It's very long, so I didn't include it here. And it will have, like, it must be 50 or 60 different nurseries in Ohio that all carry native plants. And so you can get, a lot of ideas from there. And they also have a lot of examples of native plants, and you can use them. And the zoo also, by the way, zoo also has a really good resource called Plant Trials, I think it is, or plantplaces.com. I think that's still going, where you can go research and check into the viability. If you're doing any research online, Missouri Botanical Gardens is probably one of your best resources. So if you want to look up a plant, go to Missouri Botanical Gardens and just type in the name of the plant, and you can read all kinds of information about them. They're a very good resource. Here's my resources. Anyways, I'm not going to keep this up, but I have to list them where I got my knowledge from, as well as my own classes, and I'm ready to be open for questions. And I think I need to unmute myself. No, I'm not. I'm muted.
You're good. Yeah.
Good. I just stay there. Okay.
Yep, you're good. I'm going to read to you a couple that I got in the chat first.
Okay.
Before we just let people, unmute themselves and that kind of stuff.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can.
Sources up that she just had, that last slide, while you answer questions.
Yeah, Karen, do you mind doing that?
I'd be happy to answer questions. Sure.
Oh,
no, the last slide.
Oh, the last slide. This one?
Yeah, can you leave that up while answering questions?
Oh, sure.
Thank you.
All right. So the first questions I got were from Amanda Taylor, and I think you already answered one. Feel free, Amanda, to take yourself off mute if you want to clarify anything. But Amanda asked, are there any native plant local companies you recommend? But I think you already kind of went into that. And she also asked for your top 5 to read list.
Top 5 to read. Oh, sort of like to read about native plants, like books and things like this?
Yeah, this is Amanda Taylor. Can you guys hear me?
Yes,
Yep.
I can.
Hi. First of all, thank you everybody for doing this. This is my first time in on this, and this has been fascinating. I'm a local environmental educator, like
Cool.
at a high school. So I'm always looking for things for my students that are interested in things like this to start reading. So just what would be your top 5, like, starter books or journals or something like that for students of mine that would like to get? I've had a couple of students that are like, I'd like to get something local, like at our campus going, at our high school going.
I would actually, what I would recommend you do is take a trip down to the Civic Garden Center when it opens back up again. They have got a whole library of books, and they're a fantastic resource for books. One of the books that I read personally are about horticulture, and I think they're probably a little bit of a step above where you're talking about.
Probably.
Yeah.
And probably for me too. I'm just trying to redo my own yard. But
yes. That's a good question. Let me think about that for just a second.
Okay, and that's fine. If you've got to move on, that's fine.
Yeah, no, that's okay. I would actually, I went to Cincinnati State.
So did I.
Yeah, cool.
I loved it. Turned my life around.
Yes, and they're a really good resource for stuff like that. You
Okay.
can actually contact their horticulture department, talk to Mark Deacon or Heather, They're the two people that, well, Mark's the chair, and they probably would come up with better resources than what I could come up with. And also they would be thrilled because they would be interested in having your students connect to something that then could working into their horticulture degrees there at Cincinnati State, which is a very, very good program.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of 2-year programs.
Yes. Well, it's a very much hands-on program. I did a lot of work working for various maintenance crews. I got a chance to work at Cincinnati Parks. I got a chance to work for some landscape firms. I worked at Xavier. You know, they're just a great resource. And because quite honestly, because I'm an older senior, I didn't want to spend a lot of time in any one place. So I did a little more dabbling here and dabbling there and different kinds of things to learn stuff as fast as I could.
Well, it's called, by the way, vintage.
Yes.
If you've been
go.
on the planet for a while, you're vintage, or you're an heirloom species.
Yes, that's it. I'm an heirloom species. Yes, that's it. I like it. I like that.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you, Nicole, for all of this. I appreciate it.
No problem. All right. Next questions are from Camille Jones. And Camille, feel free to take yourself off mute if you want to clarify anything. The first question was, can you talk about the evil blue bellflower?
Evil blue bellflower. Wow. Please explain what you mean by that. I have some bellflowers.
I don't know if it's a native, maybe it's not, but it's something that once it gets in your garden, it seems to have I don't know what you call them, like the horizontal roots that are like 6 feet down or something. And so once it gets there, it never goes away.
Oh yeah, there's a lot of those. Most of them are going to be weeds or invasives. But occasionally, like I said, you can't trust all native plants. You really can't. I have not had the experience with the bellflower, quite honestly. In that situation, I have a cultivar that I use for the bellflower, and I have not had that problem. So maybe that's the reason why they don't sell the natives in the nurseries, because that particular species can do that. And oh yes, there are natives that will do that. I had in the back of our yard, our yard goes pretty far back, and I was trying to create a natural meadow area. And in a matter of like 2 years, I had this 6-foot tall goldenrod that was gorgeous, but wanted to take over everything. And that is one of my worst nightmares of trying to weed, is trying to take that 6-foot goldenrod out of there all the time. And that spreads exactly in the same way. It puts these, shoots, I'm sorry. Yeah. Roots. I can't remember the term for them. I should know. But anyways, it does. It spreads out by these, they're only like an inch under the ground. And then it spreads and then shoots up another plant and stuff like that. Yeah, I would stay far away from that kind of a native. It can be a native. Why? Oh, here's a good native. Violets. Your everyday common violet is a native. I've always been curious about that, and I don't know about you, but they're just really prolific. Yeah. And I'm not about to plant or leave a bunch of common violets around, because my entire ground cover would be covered with it, and I wouldn't have the things that I would like to have in my garden. So they're fine in the woods.
Thank you.
Sure.
Neil, did you have another question about porcelain berry?
Yeah, the other one was the porcelain berry, which again is not a native, but is that something that the deer eat?
I don't know about deer eating them. Quite honestly, I kind of doubt it. It's sort of, well, they'd probably be last source. They don't really even eat the honeysuckle berries. That's kind of the last berry that any bird or any deer is going to eat, because it has no nutrition in it. I'm guessing that probably porcelain berry is similar. And so the birds really, you'll notice that they go for all your native plants first. And then if there's a drought or something, or whether, they don't have much choice, they'll go to the honeysuckle, and I'm guessing the porcelain berry would be very much in the same line.
Thank you.
Sure.
All right, next we have a question from Connie Jackson. Where do you get the pine fines that you use instead of mulch?
Most of your garden centers have pine fines now. And they're either called pine fines or soil conditioner. I'm almost positive that that all of your nurseries are going to have that. That's a pretty common thing. It's like a shredded pine bark is what it is. And I'm just trying to think. I even have I'm guilty of going to the Reading feed store, and they even have it there. So if they have it there, they got to have it everywhere. But I know Natorps has it. I know, White Oak Garden Center would have it. Greenfield Plant Farms would have it. Here again, if you live on the east side of town, there's actually a really good resource called Hafner's, Hafner and Sons. And they're actually a supplier for landscape firms that is open to the public. There's a few of those around. I'm sure there's one on the west side too. And I go there for a lot of my pine fines because you can usually get them a little bit less expensive. Plus they load them in your trunk. Does that help?
Yeah, Connie, did that answer your question?
Yes, it did. Sorry, I had to unmute my computer. Yes, it did. And is it an actual brand name, Pine Fines?
No, that's not the brand name. That's actually the name of the product.
Okay.
Yeah, Pine Fines. Some bags, they come in a big bag, just like mulch does usually. And just if you look at it, if it's one of those clear bags, you can see through it, or if it's got a hole punched in it, just make sure it looks like little tiny pine chips that are maybe 1/4 of an inch in size, up to 1/2 an inch. And it looks like a bunch, it looks like somebody took the outside of a pine tree and just shredded it down.
Okay. Yeah, and I see the note here about Schwartz mulch because I actually live in Kettering, and I get the leaf compost from Schwartz mulch. I've gotten it for years, but I get frustrated because they put a lot of sticks in it, and it's horse manure, leaf compost, and sticks. But then every spring I have to clean out all these sticks, out of my beds first, because everything else kind of either erodes away or works in the soil, and then I'm left every spring with a pile of sticks in my beds.
Yeah, I understand. I actually only use compost in my vegetable gardens. I don't use it in my regular flower gardens. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
All right, the last one I have in the chat, and then we'll just open it up to anybody who wants to unmute themselves or raise their hand, is from Meg Shaughnessy. I hope I said that right. I'm wondering about a recommendation for native trees that would be good to plant in an asphalt parking lot that is being repaved.
Yeah, sorry, that's me. I teach at St. Alex, and just we have this huge, just asphalt, big blacktop parking lot, and they were thinking about putting in some trees in honor of the seniors who are missing the end of their year here, and it's just a terrible parking lot that has no vegetation in it at all. And anyways, I was just curious if you had I was just trying to do some research on it the last couple of days, and I figured I would ask since I was in here if that's something that you had any insight into.
Sure. I'd be happy to answer that. That's actually a real good question, because when you got a heat sink like that, you've got to be really careful what kind of trees you put in there. And here again, the maintenance is going to be part of the challenge you're going to deal with. I am not an arborist, so my knowledge comes more from selling trees at Natorps and learning in school, different things to look for in a tree. And your biggest thing is, if it's in a parking lot, you want to make sure it's going to be a tree that's going to be fairly, obviously a good straight, sturdy trunk. And then I would go for a native definitely, because although there are some cultivars, or there are some other trees that work well, but I would go with a native. Like a locust is a possibility. Those can be used. I'm trying to think of what else I've seen. You want to create some shade. So you want something that's going to have a high canopy. So, you know, I would look for something in that direction. This is where actually going to your nursery, you're going to probably get the best information, because I worked with, there's 2 guys that worked at Natorps who had been doing it for, you know, gosh, 10, 20 years. And one of them was even one of their landscape designers originally. And the 2 of those guys know their trees backwards and forwards. And trees are just a real special area. A lot of horticulturists will know plants and shrubs and things like that, but the trees kind of get into a whole another ball game where you got to learn about root systems and all that kind of stuff. And they would probably know more of that information. I would stay away from the maples. The maples, you know, can possibly create a root structure. You got to watch that. Make sure it's something that has more of a. I don't know whether there's any trees that actually put a tap root down. I think most of them are still, you know, just fairly surface roots, but you could ask them.
I was kind of curious, as far as like trees that are bred to be like thornless for honey locusts or seedless, would that be like technically a cultivar, a nativar, as far as the, you know, variations on native trees?
It just depends. Yeah, I mean, it's possible that thornless might have come from a nativar situation, you know, where they found trees that didn't have many thorns and then worked with them. But it also could be a cultivar, because in cultivars, you know, what they might do is plant like 50 trees, and then they pick out the ones that have the least amount of thorns, and then they take those and they plant those. And then, you know, it takes like, you know, years and years and years to come up with a good cultivar that has no thorns. So that's sometimes how those kinds of things happen, or it could have been done, quite honestly, biologically. That's the reason why I was kind of stumbling a little bit between nativar and cultivar, because you don't always know. You don't know unless you research each one of them to find out how that particular one was you know, created. You have to know from the biology of it. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
Yeah, Karen, so thanks so much. We didn't have any other questions in the chat, just some comments. So if anybody else wants to ask any questions or comments, I'll let you go ahead and unmute yourself.
Okay.
I have a question.
Oh, okay.
Hey, I think I heard Lawrence Taylor.
Yes, this is Kathy Taylor. I live in Milford, and we have a creek that runs through the back of our property, and all along it's just being consumed with the lesser celandine.
Yeah.
I don't really want to put any chemicals on it because I don't want to, you know, have anything run off into the creek. Is there anything that you know of that I could do to even begin to control this stuff, because it is taking over back there?
And it will take over. It's just a terrible, terrible plant, to be honest with you.
Well, I've got that and a mirror honeysuckles.
Oh, you got a yeah, that's pretty typical.
I know,
kind of
what
we have everywhere. I would, you know, just start taking chunks out. Roundup doesn't even kill lesser celandine. Okay.
Wow.
Yeah. Now I have heard some people talk about using vinegar. There's ways that you can use vinegar and stuff, but I don't even want that to go into the water. So
yeah,
you know, you got a tough situation where it really is going to have to be probably a manual digging up. And what's so hard about those is that lesser celandine has roots that go down, and then they have these little nodes underneath them. So you got to dig down probably 8 or 10 inches to get the whole plant out. So it's quite a bit of work. But I don't even think Cincinnati Parks or even Hamilton County Parks or any of the areas around here have figured out how to handle it, because it's basically taken over a lot of our shadier type of spots. Like I know Burnett Woods is just inundated with it. I live over in Madisonville and Duck Creek. It's really funny. They've redone this whole area of Duck Creek, and they were so excited because these wildflowers started coming up, and it was all what lesser celandine. I was just laughing, you know.
They really are pretty. I mean, my husband thinks they're pretty too.
Yeah. Oh, I know, and that's the reason why they were actually introduced as a garden plant by nurseries many years ago. Yeah.
Well, Cincinnati Nature Center is being overcome with it too, and it's too bad. We're volunteers there, and we're just seeing so much of it along some of the trails.
Yeah, the only thing we can hope is that maybe something will come along as a disease, because sometimes what happens when you end up getting too many plants of some kind, you can end up with a disease because you don't have you have a monoculture. Monocultures can create diseases. So that's the one thing I keep hoping for, is some kind of disease to get rid of it.
Sure.
With the honeysuckle too. Now honeysuckle, I will address that just real quickly because that was a question before. Honeysuckle, there are three kinds of Japanese honeysuckle. Know that there is a native honeysuckle. So don't just, go eradicating honeysuckle. Most of the stuff we have here is the invasive, but there is a native honeysuckle that's perfectly okay to buy and purchase and plant. But the regular honeysuckles, there are a lot of different ways that places will talk about getting rid of them, but by just cutting them is not going to get rid of them at all, because they literally grow back very easily. What I do is I take them, and if I get a really big one, and I've still got one big one left in the back of my yard in the back, and I'll go in there and I'll literally cut it out, get rid of all the branches, and then cut it when I make the last final cut about a foot from the ground. I do take Roundup. I take 100% Roundup. I take it concentrated, which as a consumer, I can't buy the commercial stuff anyhow. So it's already going to be diluted or diluted. But I take that, and I take a crummy old paintbrush, and I dip it in it, and then I paint within 10 minutes of having cut the trunk on the honeysuckle. And you have to do it instantaneously. Paint it with the Roundup, and just don't let it drip down the sides, and you can actually eradicate honeysuckle that way. Yeah. So, and I was talking to the other woman about
it's all right next to the creek.
Well, that's okay as long as you do it that way, because it's glyphosate is really the chemical. It's not, Roundup is a brand. Glyphosate is the chemical.
Right.
And glyphosate is made by other companies also. So they're, it's not just Roundup. There's a lot of other companies that make it too. That chemical in itself is a systemic, which means it goes into the plant itself. So when you paint it on the top of that cut off part, it's going to go down into the plant and stay within the roots of the plant itself, as long as you don't let it drip out and put too much on there. Just watch how much you put on and do it according to directions, and you shouldn't have any trouble at all with runoff. So just be really, really careful. Okay.
Great, thank you. How about, may I ask one more thing I'm trying to eradicate? I had a Bradford pear tree, and it's planted way too close to the house. So I had a tree company come cut it down, and now I have probably 60 shoots coming up all over.
Yes, the Bradford pear has an interesting story, and I think I'm telling it correctly. The Bradford pear was considered the most ultimate of street trees that they'd come out with as a cultivar. And when it first came out, you saw them planted everywhere, all up and down streets and stuff.
Yeah.
And then what happened was they found that it had a weak trunk system, and it started breaking off in storms. And so they decided to come up with a couple other cultivars, and they came up with the there's 2 other varieties that I can't think of right now. That's my what would she call that? My oh, it wasn't seniorness. Anyways,
I know what you mean.
You know what I mean. Anyways,
Right.
so these other varieties were developed, and when they did those, nature has an interesting way of cross-pollinating. And what happened was that they created a cross-pollination of the old Bradford pear and this new variety, which then became those lovely white pear trees that you see all over the highway in the spring, that are all invasives that are displacing a lot of our native plants, including the red buds. There used to be way more red buds that would bloom all up and down the side, and a lot of them are gone. So the Bradford pear is now actually finally, I think it was last year, they have 20 plants that are Ohio invasive species, and you can look those up now, that they've actually put on the list, that nurseries are not allowed to sell anymore. Right now it's the Bradford pear, American Select is the other one, and then there's another variety. And my understanding is, I think within the next 5 years, they have to get rid of all of those cultivars of pear trees. They are not allowed to sell them. But that's part of the problem we have with nurseries, and when you buy things on catalogs and stuff like that, nobody tells you that, this plant actually is an invasive type plant, because they're a business. And so that's why I say you've got to research things you buy, because you just don't know. I mean, it can be a perfectly good nursery. Even the the burning bush, those red burning bushes that everybody loves. They're starting to show up in the woods. They're over in French Park. We see them walking up and down the trails. Privet used to be a really well-known shrub that was used a lot, but neither one of those got on the invasive species list. They're hoping that maybe they'll get on in the next 2 or 3 years. But until it gets on this list, there's nobody that can, penalize them for selling something. So they do. So we have to be careful about that.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate this so much. This is my first time on too, and I'm just loving it.
Good.
It's wonderful.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. We can still do more questions. I'm just going to stop the recording so it doesn't get too long for people. Okay. But Carol, I want to say you were trying to ask a question earlier. Do you have a question for Karen?